All right, you're on.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, I'm gonna yell at people and get handouts.
Yeah, we do have a rather lengthy, it's hard on these handouts. We'll have to reduce them down. We have a lot to do today. Thank you for being here. I hope there will be some others coming who, let me start with a little bit of review from last time. So we introduced Jesus the Visionary last week, and that is someone who is dominated by the psychological function I'm talking about is intuition, dominated by an idea, by an insight, by a vision, by an experience. And this experience was of Yahweh's embrace within the veil. I think that's the simplest way to say it. Yahweh's embrace within the veil. And this idea was so dominant and so transforming to him that it transformed everything about his relation, not only to God, but to Israel, to his own religion, to himself, to his sense of ministry and mission and calling. And we see this, the key verse here is in Mark chapter 1. I don't have the exact verse. I think it's 14, somewhere there, where it says that he saw the heavens torn open. Talking about the tearing of the heavens and this violent act of this boundary crossing between the worlds, where the heavenly world was so suddenly open to the earthly. And this is the story of the divine man. This is the story of God incarnate. So, of course, the boundary between the worlds needs to be torn. Now, why did I just lose my... There we go. Okay. We used a couple of passages. I won't go into them, but just basically, you may recall I talked about how he cleansed and healed the leper and sent him back to the priest as a testimony against them. Really, this is a priestly figure. I don't know why contemporary Christian theology doesn't talk much. Maybe it's a Catholic Protestant thing. I don't know. They don't talk about the priesthood of Jesus much. And, maybe there's some of that in there. But he is definitely, I think, conceives himself as a priestly figure, one who stands between the worlds. And he himself is the boundary between the worlds that's bringing one to the other. And in Peter's house, we talked about it becoming a sort of makeshift temple where the people gather around and Jesus is at the center. He is like the Ark of the Covenant at the center of the temple. The priest couldn't get in or out. As we recall, that was a reflection of the Old Testament and some passages along those lines. And here is Jesus, the high priest, who is pronouncing sins forgiven. Now that is huge. I mean, that's the high priest's job, and that happens on the Day of Atonement. And here Jesus is saying, my son, your sins are forgiven. And of course, he arouses quite a bit of reaction from the scribes, the scholars, the Bible scholars who were in the audience, who say to themselves, how can you say that? Only God can forgive sins. Well, Jesus, being deeply intuitive, and by the way, intuition sees higher order meanings and connections and wholes, and it's the most clairvoyant of all the functions. It sees around corners. It anticipates. It can immediately grasp a whole that the more analytical temperament can't see when it looks at the particulars. But he says, why do you reason so in your hearts? And of course he says, in order that you may know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, I say, take up your bed and walk. So the healing now is a demonstration of his absolute, unwavering confidence and conviction in this dominant idea. And so here is Jung's sort of general assessment. Part of what I want to do in this series is introduce you to Carl Jung and some of his writings, which I think are fabulous. So here we go. This is what Jung says. If we cast our glance down the long procession of the centuries, we find scattered like so many points of light, strange figures who appear to belong to a different order, alien, almost super mundane beings who relate to the historical conditions just enough to be understood, but who essentially represent a new species of man. The world does not give birth to them, but rather they create a world, a new heaven and earth. They identify with the idea they bring to the world, and they live out this idea feeling that it will endure forever and that it is beyond violation by the exegesis of men. They are their own idea, untrammeled and absolute among the minds of their age. One such man was Jesus of Nazareth. He knew this, and he did not hesitate to proclaim it to the world. So here's a man dominated by a single, overriding and overpowering idea. Sometimes present is not cooperating. There we go. So this is what we got so far from last time. We've got the morning and dawn of our drama. We've got the priestly vision of embrace within the veil. We have the dominant function of intuition. So now we're going to talk a little bit about thinking. Thinking now I would consider in psychological terms the support function. That is to say, in Jungian theory, we have a dominant function, and that's the function we use the most to adapt and get along in the world. We're very comfortable with that function, whatever it is. It can be any one of the four: thinking, feeling, intuition, or sensation. But we also develop what's called a support function, a second function that stands in service of that dominant function. And for Jesus, I'm suggesting, at least in my reading of the gospel, that his second function is thinking. And so this translates in religious parlance to wisdom. Jesus is a teacher. He's a sage. He traffics in language in such a brilliant way. And I couldn't even possibly begin to get into all the detail of that in just a few minutes. So let me quickly recommend a book to you, anybody who's interested in the verbal and rhetorical strategies of Jesus. Here's one by Robert Funk called Honest to Jesus. Fabulous book, good summary. You can't do any better than that. So what I want to do today is just sort of introduce this idea of thinking, how it functions in support of intuition in the gospel, and then we're going to move into feeling as well, the third function. And that's where the drama really starts to happen. You know, thinking and intuition are sort of Galilean traits. That is, in his Galilean ministry, Jesus is a healer and a teacher. And that's going to change really quickly, suddenly, in a dark sort of way. But at this point, what we want to look at is thinking as verbal conceptualization, terms, frameworks, making the categories that are needed to understand something in a little more concrete terms. So what Jesus is going to do in his verbal strategies is actually counter order. In other words, he's going to challenge the dominant categories. He's going to deconstruct, if you want to use a modern term, a lot of the expectations, the conventional wisdoms of Israel. And it's amazing to see how he does this in such sharp and witty ways. So let's get a couple examples of what I'm talking about. Jesus the sage, the counter-order wisdom. He's going to subvert, by the way, the clean and unclean sort of dominant way that the conventional religion was looking at how they stack people up. You know, in Israel it was a kind of a legal system, or at least the way it's presented in the Gospels, I would say. Maybe, I don't know, that may or may not have been the total reality, but that's the picture. It's a legal system, and it's rooted in these codes that are, in some fundamental ways, excluding. You're clean, you're unclean. If you're clean, you're in. If you're unclean, you're out. My understanding from scholars is that a full 80% of the population was considered unclean for one reason, one ritual or other kind of reason. You were sick or whatever it was, you were in that category. Can you imagine a religious system that excluded 80% of the people? Not working too effectively, I would say. So Jesus comes and he's going to challenge, he's going to subvert that system. And he's going to use not only a dominant vision of forgiveness within the veil, which is in and of itself radical. And we just take that for granted, but that is radical, But he's now going to use verbal strategies to bring that home, to hammer it home. And again, so much stuff here I can't possibly get into the detail. But parables, we all know how he used parables. Aphorisms, proverbs, riddles, humor, reversals is something I really like and I want to point out to you. So his point in these sorts of figures of speech and uses is to, again, to subvert these expectations, not only to subvert them, but to give people an experience of a sort of counter-order wisdom. And let me just put this on pause for a second and say one thing in terms of Jungian psych. In Jungian psych, there is this notion that the unconscious compensates the conscious. And what that simply means is we tend to be fragmented in our psyche, and we tend to gravitate towards certain things that we're comfortable with, and we repress and leave out large areas with which we are not comfortable. And this becomes the unconscious. Well, it's the unconscious's job, so to speak, in the larger picture, to compensate that one-sidedness. And so this is what Jung means by the shadow. These things pop into our lives. It seems like they're coming from out there, that are always challenging our one-sidedness, kind of trying to pull us over and open us up to these counter positions and perspectives. And Jesus as a figure, if you pull this in and look at it as a collective story, Jesus as a representative or archetypal figure comes to Israel as a compensation. He comes to compensate a one-sidedness. And I just expressed that one-sidedness as the legalism, the clean, the unclean. In a sense, Jesus is strong and dominant, where Israel is weak and lacks imagination. Israel has no dominant, intuitive vision. It has no imagination when it comes to religion. The word religion means religio, means to link back. Well, if you're excluding 80% of the people, you are not linking back to the source. And so, as the proverb says, where there is no vision, a people perish. Jesus comes with a vision. He is intuitive, where Israel is not intuitive. And now, with wisdom, Jesus is wise, where Israel has somehow fallen into a sort of conventionality. There is a conventional wisdom, and it is constantly presented in the Gospels, but it is constantly subverted. Here are just some quick examples. Oh, I want to say one more thing. Then some examples. Not only does Jesus subvert the common wisdom, but the way he does it enables the listener or the reader to experience this alternate reality that he speaks about. So it's not just verbiage. I would say it's an induction. He's inducing people into the kingdom of heaven. He's actually invoking the experience. And he does it by challenging categories and by, in a sense, pulling the rug out from under them with surprise, shock, surprise endings, reversals. And I can give quick examples. I think the longer examples are a little more interesting. But here are some quick ones. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. The Sabbath was not made for man, but man. Man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. Going to get that right. Be as innocent as doves and as shrewd as serpents. And here are two longer examples. I'll just spend a minute or two with, and then we're going to move on. You will recall that as Jesus is moving in his ministry, healing lots of people, he is accused of healing by the power of Beelzebub. And Jesus has a kind of interesting and subtle and nuanced response to that. And he said, instead of saying, you know, I'm not healing by that, I'm healing by God's power, of course. He says, a house divided cannot stand. And see how that subverts, immediately it flips everything, and it puts the listener, the reader, on their heels. Wait a minute, oh, I have to think about that. Yeah, okay. And then he starts to go on. Let's say, a house divided cannot stand. If Satan is divided against Satan, then Satan is done. But in order to bind a strong, in order to plunder, say, how's it go? You needed a strong man to come in and bind the strong man, or stronger man, really, to bind the strong man. Then they can plunder their goods. So now, instead of Satan being the plunderer, now Jesus is plundering Satan. And it's a wonderful, clever little way of just flipping the whole argument right on its ear. Immediately following that, got ahead of myself here. Immediately following that, they accuse him of, not they accuse, his mother and brother show up. And they're knocking on the door, and you know, they think he's kind of lost it. And they've come to retrieve him. And somebody says, Rabbi, your mom and brothers are outside, they've come to get you. You know, time to go home. Charade over. And immediately there's sort of a acerbic wit that comes out of him. Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? But those who do the will of God. Well, not only does that subvert and reverse the immediate situation, but in a larger sense, it calls into question the very core question of what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be the people of God? Who are my mother and my brothers? Is it ethnic? Is it genetic? Are you born into the kingdom of God? Or is it something else? Is this something larger that God has created about doing the will of God? This intention that is really the point of the entree into the kingdom. So there are these verbal strategies all throughout the Gospel of Mark that invoke this kind of reversal and these new ways of putting things together. And this is in support of the dominant vision of intuition. So here we have Jesus, who is a priestly sage. He's a healing teacher. Someone who speaks with authority, not as the scribes. Someone who induces this experience of this alternative reality, this new way of thinking and relating to God, who is embracing his people within the veil. Tending my present here. Okay, so I know that was extremely brief, but kind of all I got. So if you want more, actually the handout will really fill out the details. That's one of the reasons it's a little bit lengthier today. It'll go through some of the examples I was talking about. Try to give you the sense for how this counter-order wisdom is functioning. And I think I do want to say one more thing before I leave. We put the second category in here. Now we've gone from the morning into the daytime with wisdom. It's still in Galilee. And that is this. Jesus' vision, it really kind of hit me as I woke up this morning. I thought, yeah, okay, we need to talk about this. Jesus' vision is feminine. And you can see it. It's feminine. You can see it right in the initial intuition itself, even though it speaks of God as Father, because that's the conventional, that's the way Israel understood and related to God. But the whole point of it is God's embrace within the veil. How maternal you can't get more maternal than that. And, so his wisdom is also very feminine, because it talks about a way of seeing yourself as God's children in a way that the conventional wisdom was not doing. The conventional wisdom was dividing and excluding, but Jesus is including and embracing by pronouncing sins forgiven and by challenging these categories of sort of egoic assertion. You know, the first shall be last. The last shall be first. And that's a whole reversal. And it's a sort of affirmation of this essentially feminine vision of God's embrace within the veil. And so again, it's a compensation for an overly masculinized spirituality or religion that's dominant at the time. However, and that's all really nice, but it's only the first part of the story. And, you know, part of me when I read this sort of through a Jungian light, I just think, man, couldn't you have stayed in Galilee? You know, things would have been so much better. And it's wonderful. We got this vision, we got this wisdom, we got these new categories, ways of relating to the divine, or, you know, all of it. But the story would not be complete had it stopped there or continued in that way. Because this is the story of God incarnating. That's the story. It's God becoming man and fleshing. And these two functions are, in a sense, the most ethereal. They're the most abstract and heavenly. And that is not enough. God is coming down. You know, God is descending into the human drama. And so Jesus is sort of embodies that. He's going to act that out. And so even though he's in his strength in intuition and wisdom, he is forced by some inner compulsion to move in a direction now from where he was strong and they were weak to where he is weak and they are strong. He's going to march into Jerusalem. This profoundly, if I can say it this way, this profoundly introverted version of the inner spiritual world is about to confront an established, ingrained, militarized system that's going to eat him up. It's going to destroy him. Zeal for thine house has destroyed me, basically. So now something is missing yet in this vision. And if I can say it in a word, because I don't have a lot of time, it is feeling. And what is feeling? Feeling is that function that is a relational function. It's the function of value. It's how we impart or discover value and how we relate to something. Do we accept it? Do we reject it? Is it fair? Is it unfair? Is it just? Is it unjust? This sense of persons and relating is dominant in feeling. And I began to relate this to prophecy thanks to Marcus Borg, because as reading Borg, he said something very, I thought, insightful about prophets and prophecy. He said the prophet does not just, I gotta make sure I get it right, know the thoughts of God. The prophet feels the feelings of God. I thought, well, that's pretty good. I like that. Because that's really where the connection is here. Jesus now is moving into a function that for him, if I may say so, he's crossed the meridian. The transfiguration, by the way, is the key moment. And that is the midpoint of the gospel. Now remember, I've talked about this being a solar story. We're at the midpoint now in the transfiguration. That's that second moment where the boundaries between the worlds are obliterated or become permeable. And the voice from heaven says, this is my son, listen to him. Immediately after that, coming down out of the mountain, he starts to talk in terms that are very strange and sudden. They are not present before, suddenly they are present. The Son of Man will go to Jerusalem and will be arrested and will be killed and will rise. And the disciples have no framework for this at all. It's radical. Now Jesus becomes obsessed, as it were, with going to Jerusalem and confronting the establishment there. So I think at this moment, The story turns dark. He shifts in a way from the priest and the rabbi to the prophet, and ultimately, I guess the term would be to the martyr, to the one who's going to, maybe a more biblical term would be the servant, the one who's going to lay down his body and sacrifice for his cause, for his people. My evidence for this, aside from Borg's suggestive remark, is largely circumstantial. It's interesting to me that when Jesus starts to move toward Jerusalem, his actions, his words, as I just mentioned, beginning to prophesy about his own demise, his actions become almost, as Jung could have predicted, shadow. They're shadow actions. And again, let me just remind you, I didn't want to go there. Let me remind you that Jung talks about the shadow. When we go in shadow, we are now in inferior functions. We're operating out of functions that we're not comfortable with. Why do we go into shadow? Because the ones we were used to, aren't working. And so in the larger picture of this drama, the vision and thinking, while they have a powerful effect, they're not getting the job done. So now Jesus is moving into inferior functions, feeling and later sensation, in order to bring this final sort of confrontation and integration with the existing system. So he's in shadow, and when you're in shadow, you act in a way that's can be childish, can be tempered, can be excitable, can be kind of primitive. It doesn't really work. When we go into shadow, we mess things up, because we're not used to those shadow functions. If I'm a low-key, introverted guy, if I get into shadow enough, I can get extroverted in a way that's not pretty. Just because I am not comfortable in that. I'm just not there. So when I try to be extroverted and try to be social and try to be, I trip over my own feet. It just happens because it's not, I'm just not comfortable. That's all there is to it. And so in a psychological sense, I'm suggesting that this is going on in the story. Let's see, feeling, I think there's a good definition of feeling that I'd like to read. Might help here, if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. This is Jung. Feeling imparts a definite value. Hence, feeling is a kind of judgment, different from intellectual judgment, in that its aim is not to establish conceptual relations, but to set up a subjective criterion of acceptance or rejection. Although feeling is in itself an independent function, it can easily become dependent on another function. It is then a mere, here's a big word, concomitant, or assistant, I guess, of that function, and is not repressed only insofar as it accommodates itself to the other functions. So basically what he's saying is feeling now is serving something else. It's moving as a servant, perhaps of his dominant vision, or perhaps of the final feeling, the final type or function that's going to come. Now, in talking about feeling and talking now, we've addressed three functions and there's one left to go. Is that right? And the last one is?
Sensation.
Sensation. And you can see that sensation, that most primitive, most essential of all functions that simply notes that something is there, is about to show up on the scene. And as he marches into this, finally coming at the end, sensation for the servant. So next time, the cross and beyond, we've got some time. I'm going to open it up to questions. I forget when we end here.
Well, 25 after.
Well, okay, so we got a little bit of time. I sort of breezed through. Maybe could spend a little more time on wisdom, but we may do that. Anyway, any questions about where we're going with this and what we're talking about? Yes, sir.
One of the more obscure parables is that of the Good Samaritan.
Yes, that's it.
When he asks who is the neighbor, and the neighbor is the, you're supposed to do good by your neighbor, but the neighbor is the Samaritan. which is a kind of a twist. And
It subverts the whole category, which is
Yeah.
a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because the conventional wisdom would say neighbor X equals so-and-so.
Yeah.
But the parable not only, inspires, but it subverts and challenges. And that's his wisdom right there. Subverts the established category. Neighbor is, whoops, it's my enemy almost in some way. It's everybody's
Well, the
enemy.
neighbor was the Samaritan.
Yeah. Well,
But he's supposed to be love your neighbor, but the Samaritan was the neighbor. Was the crippled guy on the street? Was he loving the Samaritan? I mean, it seems that's sort of odd.
it is odd.
Yeah.
It is exactly, it's subversive. That's all I know how to call it. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I always have questions for you. I love this. I love this class. You sort of imply, and I'm just curious if Jung would articulate it the way you're articulating it, but you sort of imply that the Gospels is God coming down, almost like an outside thing coming into the essence of what it means to be human. But hearing other lectures, I almost thought that Jung would go the other approach. It's really our humanity rising up from below, from these archetypes that are part of what it means to be human, that are manifesting themselves in the behavior of Jesus, rather than some external thing from the outside. Could you talk a little bit about where does all this come
Yes.
from?
I think, let me try to go back, because earlier I had put up a little, one of my screens. This is a parallel drama. It is a drama of descent and ascent,
That's right.
both going on at the same time. From the point of view of itself, if I can use that Jungian term, or from that greater mystery, it's a drama of descent into the particular, into the incarnate, into, from God, that abstraction, into Jesus of Nazareth, the concrete historical person who suffers and dies, who lives a real life. But on another level, it's also the psyche's story, and that is one of ascent. Or it's one way to look at it. It's a descent into the unconscious in a way, but it's a movement toward this larger dimension of your own being.
Right.
And so that's the genius of it, is that it can be looked at from both ways, and simultaneously both stories are going on. From the point of view of myth, it's a story of a God's descent. But from the point of view of psyche, it's a story of development and individuation, growth, realization.
That makes that more helpful.
And so you have to look at it both ways.
Yeah.
My dissertation was entitled, two big words, but individuation and incarnation, because it was trying to emphasize that both of these things are going on. That's the power and the value of myth,
Right.
is that it's able to convey these sort of multi-dimensional truths in a way that's simple and like a parable.
Right.
But it's very nuanced and very complex.
Would you go as far as to say that every life is somehow a coming together of those two forces?
Yes, I would. I think that's a deeply Jungian thing to say. So we are pulled by our destiny. We are not determined by our past. We're pulled towards something, and that something is this greater dimension of consciousness itself. We're becoming conscious. We're waking up collectively and individually.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Paul Tillich,
Tillich, yes.
he said the two paradoxes are that God became a man and that we are simultaneously saints and sinners.
Yes.
And I think that captures those two sides, I think, of what you're saying very, very strongly, very clearly.
I think for me, and I'm probably going to close with this right here, just to sort of step back from this whole process. When I was 19, and I've told my story, I'm not going to repeat it, but my circumstance was not a good one at that moment. I was facing the draft. I had a very low number in the lottery, 32. I thought I was gone. I was a goner.
Oh my gosh.
And my sister had passed away a year before. My mother had passed away when I was 8. There was this sense that perhaps life was a little bit overwhelming at that moment. And religion came to me, Christ came to me as a way, may I use the word, as an escape, as an ascent, as a sort of a greater, higher, something that I could grab onto and sort of step out of this life that was overwhelming to me. I'd been using drugs and, all of that. And in a moment, that there was a powerful transformation in my life, something I will always be grateful for. But as I've gotten older, I've recognized that religion, that sort of religion as escape, and I know that's a little bit demeaning, but forgive the term. That religion as escape, that escape could only be temporary. It was not permanent, it was in a sense not lasting, not real. And that I had to somehow descend back into my body, back into my locality, back into Randy who lives here, back into my story. Disappointing though it may have been, painful though it may have been at times, but it's my story. It's who I am. And this reading of the gospel enables me to grasp it again as life itself, because I can see it now as the psyche's story coming to itself. It's life in search of itself. And that is so powerful for me. Now I can live my life. I can face my mortality, I can face my disappointments, and I can say yes to it all. And that is, another flip and transformation within the religious vision and myth that has happened to me. I'm going to close with a poem. I've been wanting to read this thing for weeks and weeks.
And now you got the wiggle room.
And now I got it. So you're stuck with me for a couple more minutes. Here we go. Actually, it's 2 poems. These are Rumi poems. Anybody know Rumi?
Yeah. Right.
If you don't know Rumi, learn Rumi. Find Rumi. Discover him. He's awesome. So anyway, get the first one first. Would you like to have revealed to you the truth of the friend, capital F? Leave the rind and descend into the pith. Fold within fold, the beloved drowns in his own being. This world is drenched with that drowning. Isn't that great?
Boy, that's a
This
whopper.
world
Yeah.
is drenched with that drowning. And one more that I think makes the exact same point. How will you know the difficulties of being human if you're always flying off to blue perfection? Where will you plant your grief seeds? Workers need ground to scrape and hoe, not the sky of unspecified desire. There it is. I don't know. Can't say anything better than that.
Yeah,
So I think I will be quiet.
Thanks, Randy. Hey, Randy, one quickie. Some people have asked us if there's a primer, a book that would be suggested that people could, who are like, well, I'm kind of interested in this, but this is just overwhelming. That's sort of an entry-level access point to some of this material. That could be a first step for them. Besides Rumi poetry, sounds like something I should go to bed, read it before I go to sleep at night. Could you at least think about that and then share it maybe next
think
week?
about it. There are a few I can think of, but let me reflect on
Yeah.
that. I've been bringing books, but I'm more specifically, I'm going to try to come up with one
Yes,
or two
exactly. That's what they
that
want.
really fit that criteria.
How about Joseph Campbell?
Well, Campbell is phenomenal. Matter of fact, we will be doing Campbell next week because we're doing the archetypal cross next week. So we're going to finish all the 4 and see the dynamic of how the 4 functions work together toward wholeness. And Campbell's the man for that. So he's great. All right.
All right, thanks everybody. One more week next week. Make sure you show up. There's handouts I put out from the last few weeks if you missed a handout from a previous week. And then we're posting all these to YouTube as well.
All right.